celebrating 100 years of universal suffrage. Well, not exactly universal suffrage, but suffrage for a small number of women, but also an awful lot of working class men also got the vote in 1918, a fact which is often forgotten. But really here we are looking to the future and thinking about some of the other things that we still need to fight for.
My name's Janice Thornton. I'm the Secretary of Sheppey Promenade, and I thought it would be a good idea for us to do a project about women's work on the Isle of Sheppey during World War One. The women worked in the dockyard, but previous projects had not managed to dig up very much because it was Sheppey was famously known as Barbed Wire Island, and with the military, the navy and the air force, the fledgling air force, everything was top secret. But people worked in all those industries across the island, and we thought that that story must be there to be told. So we did a bid to the Heritage Lottery, and we were successful. And what else we were successful with was we applied to join the Gateways project with Kent University, and we were not only accepted, but we were supported and made much of. And we've had quite a lot of interaction with Kent University for this project. They've been very supportive and sort of shown us how to do things like archive training. They've also suggested ways that we could tackle things, and have been very supportive about what our results are. So we've had quite a big input from the Gateways project into our project. It's a World War One project. Various universities around the country have got together as part of their outreach. They're supporting local projects to look at what happened World War One in various areas. There's one which is called Football and Peace, which picks up on the famous story of the football played in no man's land in Christmas 1914, but also looking at women's football, because women's football was quite a big movement during World War One, when the women were playing football and the men were at war. There is also lots of local projects. I noticed one that's come online quite recently, which is very similar to ours, is about the women working in the dockyard in Portsmouth, and they've given theirs the name the Triangular Badge Women, because the women that worked on war service wore a triangular badge, and each badge had an individual number on the back. So the women that worked in the dockyard here would have had triangular badges, and sometimes when you're looking at archive photos, the women have got the triangular badges on. I've not found any photos on Sheppey of women wearing triangular badges, but they must have had them, and there's not a central record in the National Archive of the triangular badges. So that's what Gateway is. It's an outreach project by the universities to support local projects, how they research World War One, how they take that forward, how they disseminate it, how they tell local people all about what they found. We decided to make a bid to the Heritage Lottery Fund because they had funding earmarked for World War One projects, and we applied to them and were successful, and we said that we wanted to tell the story of women on Sheppey, but we were also going to tell the story of women's suffrage on Sheppey, the story of the war, and then what happened when the women had to go back to their ordinary jobs once the men come back from the trenches, etc. So we had a couple of meetings with the Heritage Lottery, and they supported us and highlighted things that they would like to see, and we made our bid and were successful. So that was very, very exciting. We were assigned a project manager from HLF, and we then set about how we would approach the project. And we got a group of volunteers together by advertising on Facebook and in various local sort of community groups. We contacted them direct and said, we're doing this project and would you like to be involved? So we got key members from like the aviation rooms. We got Rosemary Hawkins from there. Sheppey Little Theatre helped out with as we were finding out things. It was a venue for us to talk about the things that we'd found. We worked with Big Fish Arts on a community play, and local people were involved in doing that play, and it was taken around to local events in order that people would get to see the play in various locations. So we sort of reached out wide. There was aspirations. We went to the Magnificent Men and Women event in Laysdown, and again sort of took our project there and spoke to people and asked if they wanted to be involved. So having reached out to all these groups, different groups had different things that they were willing to contribute. We also went to Canterbury and met with the various professors there who were very, very interested in our project and keep emailing us all the time with little things. So we met with them, and they were very keen on our project because it was, at that time, there wasn't anything similar in Kent. So we were, they talked to us quite a lot about women's history and things that we might want to sort of pull out from our research. So we then got a small group of people willing to do the research side together. So I led that side of the project.
It's important because it's a project that looks at the hidden roles for women in the World War One period. So very much in that period, certainly as it was seen then, women would have been seen in their roles as wives and mothers, very much in that role. But I think that World War One made such a huge difference in terms of the kinds of roles that women were doing. So the project was getting under the skin of that, is actually finding what were these women doing during that period of time, particularly in relation to Sheppey. And I think what I was involved with was certainly looking at, well, there's the domestic side, but there was also what other things we're doing. And part of what we were doing in the play, for example, was there's contrasty songs of a song about domesticity, and then a song looking at, well, there's 8 million women who have no say in the running of the country and in what was actually going in any capacity. So it was looking at what were they actually doing and what to kind of the hidden things that were going on for them.
So one of the things I did was go to the National Archive, went with Jo and Rosemary, and we looked at the dockyard records to look for women workers there. But because the women weren't pensioned, there's very few references to women in the dockyard records. But what we did find is when they started employing clerical women. So initially there was only the odd woman being employed as a typist, but as time went on, you see more and more women being employed. And this corresponded to an article in the local paper where they first talked about they were going to have women clericals, and then it talked about how when the women turned up for their interview, they said, we're going to give you the dockyard exam. And the dockyard exam is what the boys were coached in doing, and in fact the school year revolved around when the dockyard exams were, and the boys would have gone up for the dockyard exams, and that would have been their career mapped out for them for the rest of their days. But the women were suddenly given the dockyard exam, 30 women, and only 6 passed, because their education would not have necessarily provided them with the answer. They might not have had like the mathematical knowledge to answer the sort of technical side that the boys would have been answering because they'd been schooled to do it. But women did pass the exam, and those women then become clerical workers, and you can then see their history in the dockyard records, that they were, because then they're civil servants, and you'll see them as civil servants in the civil service records.
My main focus, I've been involved with some of the other museums and heritage centres on the island, researching the role of women specifically in World War I on Sheppey. We've had funding to go up to the archives at Kew, and we've had also some photographs and some information from people via social media about their relatives. So I've been doing quite a bit of research on that, and it's been very interesting because the roles are not necessarily the traditional roles that you would expect from a woman. Yes, there were some in a domestic role working in the officers' mess, etc., but we've also found 2 ladies who were in the motor transport division. They trained near Epsom, came back here. They were driving very large trucks, ambulances, transporting people, they were transporting parts presumably, riding large motorcycles as dispatch riders, and we presume from their training not only driving these vehicles but were also able to maintain them, so definitely stepping outside what was considered a traditional role for women at that time.
So we got a group of people who were willing to do research together. We had a couple of initial meetings where we talked to them about what they would want to do, because what we wanted was for people to do the research they wanted to do. We didn't want to dictate to them, and so different people chose different things. Like Linda Brinklow chose munitions, she was interested in that area. Jo Eden was interested in the land girls. Rosemary, being part of the aviation centre, she wanted to do aviation, and various other people had little bits and pieces they wanted to look at, and I decided I would look at the sort of general. I wanted to do the dockyard, but because it was very secret, I thought, well, that may not be enough to do, so I did general sort of work, that sort of anything else that wasn't covered that women were doing during World War One. And the Gateways at Kent University gave us the services of a professor for the day who taught us about how to research, how to use archives, how we would want to structure our research, and areas that we could look at for hidden things, such as looking at police records, which would tell you about things like prostitution, which wouldn't necessarily sort of come up in the local papers in a normal story. So we were looking at those kind of areas. We then also got a local woman to help us with the IT archiving, which was a challenge, and we probably haven't used that as much as we should have done, but how we could share files and do stuff on that side of things. But again, because our project has been quite successful, we've been asked if we would like to archive our stuff at the University of Belfast, Queen's University. So again, we've got another partner there that we didn't look for, and so whereas we'd set up a Google Drive, now all we have to do is email Queen's University and they archive the stuff for us. So that's another good result as far as we're concerned. So that's one of the challenges, has been where to find information, because the local papers are quite scant during World War One, and they're quite masculine in the way that they're written. Things are happening with women, but they don't record those things. It's all football. And if you read our local papers during the war and before the war and after the war, you'd think it was a naval chronicle, because it's all about the movement of ships, what ships are coming into the dockyard, what ships are going out, who's captaining what ships, who's been promoted. And those people aren't necessarily even people from the island. There'd be some captain comes in, he was previously at Portsmouth, he's come in, he spend a year here, then they go off, and then later on there might be a story. Captain Bloggs has been promoted, as if that's of interest to people, but obviously to some people it was. But it's not about local people, but that's what the local papers are filled with. So it was quite a challenge finding stories about local people in our local paper. As I say, we looked at the police. I looked at the police records because that showed when women were appearing in court, and there was a lot of fighting. People have arguments with their neighbours, and then they're out on the street fighting, which you don't have nowadays. People talk about the good old days, but it was a different kind of old days. So you find out what people were doing, what their work was, because it'd say Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Jones were in court, and Mrs. Smith accused Mrs. Jones of not paying for some clothing that she had sold her, and Mrs. Jones would say that this had happened, and Mrs. Smith's daughter was a harlot or whatever, and so you get a different story that way. I went to the National Archives with Jo, and we went through the dockyard records because every employee in the dockyards across the whole of the empire are recorded. So it's not just the UK. So with the results of what we've found, we've been trying to put it out there as soon as we can. So we've been doing a variety of things, such as there's been a play, and we've attended different events. I personally have been doing talks. I've done talk at the Sheppey Little Theatre, at Sittingbourne Library. I did them in my workplace, and various sort of other little places where we've done slide shows, and from the research that we found, sort of combining the sort of extracts from the documents we found with sort of images that we found of women, whether or not they're local women or a mixture. And so we've sort of reached out to our audience that way as well. And that has been quite successful. We've had quite a few events, and we've been sort of invited to other things to do similar sort of events. So that's been sort of one of my highlights, personal highlights, has been getting those talks ready and collecting little bits to go with it. Like I've got a collection of photographs of women at work, and I've got a collection of little badges, so like the triangular badges that women wore, a women's union badge I've bought, and that's been very good. And one of the things, like with the unionisation of the women in the dockyard, I contacted a professor at Coventry University and said to her about the research that she'd done on the Women Workers Federation, and she supplied me with all sorts of information about how the union meetings were conducted, and it told me quite a lot more to the story of the women becoming unionised in the dockyard here.
My name is Chris Reed. I run Big Fish Arts. I'm also the chair of Promenade. So when we decided to do the project about women in World War I on Sheppey, I was particularly excited by, I suppose you might say, the creative side of things. We began by, I did some talks to people and showed them slides of the suffragettes and the suffragists and all the activities that went on before the First World War, which came to a bit of a halt during the First World War because women decided to put all their efforts into the war, and halted the suffrage movement for a little while. So my big thing was we making hats, because we'd planned to have a parade, sorting out costumes, because in actual fact we had 3 different parades in the end, and also we were going to do a play. So it all went together really, making hats and costumes for the play, which we invited members of the community to come in and make hats. We also went to Aspirations, a group of elderly people made hats with them for their magnificent men and women event, and all the rehearsals for the play. So we collected all the materials that we needed together, and then we heard about the big banner parade up in London, which women were going to make artistic banners to celebrate the 100 years of the women, some of the women getting the vote. So we decided that we'd make a big banner, and we made a huge banner. In fact, when we joined the London parade, I think our banner might not have been the most beautiful, but it was the biggest. We also took that banner to the Whitstable Biennale and paraded it there, and obviously the London parade. And then our parade that we had here, where we invited women's groups, and in fact it didn't have to be just women, all groups, and we had a parade in the town with a band. And so we thoroughly enjoyed that, and we also made other smaller banners as well to go alongside Deeds Not Words, and encouraging people to vote, because it's so important. Women did all this hard work 100 years ago, and yet still there are women who don't take their vote up, and that's the thing that we feel really passionately about. So then we came to the play. The play had originally been written by a local lady called Maria Clark. We learnt the songs. It's basically narrated with little bits of acting in it. And we took that play to lots of different places: Queenborough Church, Sheppey Little Theatre, and the out-of-door one at the Magnificent Men. And obviously all the hats and costumes that we'd done, and the banners, all came together for all these events. And so Big Fish were commissioned to do these things. And then at the end of the year, we always put on a lantern parade, and in the lantern parade, some of the lanterns that we made, we thought, what could we do to represent World War One? And in the end we came up with the idea of poppies, so a lot of our lanterns were representing poppies. Another thing that we did with hundreds of school children was that there was a factory under the bridge on the island, where the women took all the old uniforms from the First World War, which had been of soldiers injured and killed, so they were in a terrible state. They got sent over, and the women repaired them and washed them and cleaned them and sent them back for the next lot of soldiers. And so with that notion of recycling, we got hold of material, duvet covers and sheets and goodness knows what. And the other thing that happened on the island was the women made ropes down at the docks. So we put these two ideas together, and we made ropes out of recycled material. But while we were making them, they did parade the ropes around, and they put lots of little messages to the soldiers and to people nowadays, in order to aim for peace and such like. So I think the children did actually get quite a lot out of it. And so we've had quite a busy year on the whole.
In a number of different ways. I think it was we certainly did the play. We also ran a series of one-off activities. So there were things like costumed sketching, so that people came in and actually did some sketching of the uniform, the suffragette uniform. And we were able to kind of explain to people, well, what do these different things mean? What does the sash mean? What do the colours mean? What is it, what is this uniform about, and how women sort of identify themselves with it? And to talk about things like the suffragists and the suffragettes, and what was the difference between those, the suffragists in terms of sort of what would be called law-abiding things, not paying your taxes. We discovered that on Sheppey there was a lady who did actually not pay her taxes, and there was a public meeting where she was able to come along and put her case, and also the case of a local dignitary was sort of, so that there was a kind of a public recognition of that. So we did that. We also had poetry readings, so people wrote, lots of local people wrote things about what was going on Sheppey, and performed it in the church at Hearty. And so there was a lot of different things, really, a lot of different creative things.
I think the biggest challenge has been time, because when we bid to the HLF, we bid for a year's worth of funding, and in no time at all the year is nearly run out, and there's still research to be done, and there's still things to be done, and we want to do a final exhibition, and it's taken a lot longer to do the research and do everything that we've wanted to do, because there's been other things that we've latched onto, such as there's something called Equalities, which was run by Parliament, which was telling the story of women's suffrage, so we got involved in that. So every time we're involved in something else, it's eaten away at the time that we've had for just concentrating on the women on Sheppey. So I think that has been my personal biggest challenge, has been trying to make the time spread enough. We wanted to do more visits to the archives and what have you than we had time for, because of course that's a whole day's undertaking, and you know, when you're working full time, there's not that many hours in the day when, you know, the evening, these places aren't open in the evening, so you've got to do it in your work time, have time of work.
Well, the highlights, because I really, really enjoy creative things, have been involved with writing, in performing, in singing, but also in terms of doing things with the children. We did during the summer, we went along to a local school, and they had an arts fair. And as part of this, we were able to do workshops with them. This is hundreds of children able to actually tell these stories. I mean, tell the story of Ridham Dock and about the women who mended the uniforms, recycled the uniforms to send back to the front. And for me, that was an absolute joy, because I think what's really important is getting those stories and telling them to the next generation, so that they're picking it up and, you know, they're understanding it, they're gaining an understanding. But also on the other side of the project, there's the research. I was involved in doing research particularly for the Land Army, and there was a lot of sifting involved. I mean, that was a real challenge to actually find anything about the Land Army on Sheppey, but we did find some stories, particular stories that are quite amusing stories, that are about the role of how women were perceived. I mean, there was one story about that they were looking for, debating whether women were able to actually milk cows or not. Which, while on the face is quite funny, but they were actually debating this, and there was a lot of sort of toing and froing from some men about, you know, oh, they're not able, Sheppey cows are different from other cows, you know. Why they thought that, I do not know, but to me there was an undercurrent of, well, we don't really want them to do this, it's just, you know, we can't cope with this. So those sort of things came up. So I enjoyed doing the research. You know, I enjoyed. I hadn't done anything like that before, quite in that way, and being able to go along with Janice and go to the National Archive. I'd never done that before. So, you know, being able to look through and actually find all these details, I found very interesting.
Well, it's really important because a lot of people don't understand what the women went through. So very many of them were imprisoned. Okay, they did carry out illegal acts, some which we might find a bit shocking. They made sure they didn't actually kill people. They blew things up, but they didn't actually kill people. They were then imprisoned, and then to make a protest, a lot of them went on hunger strike, and that was when the government unfortunately did the dreadful force feeding of them, and when they got to such a stage that the government was frightened of them dying, they didn't want to have martyrs made, they would let them out of prison, they would recover, and then if they went on another march, they'd be imprisoned again. It was called the Cat and Mouse, which happened for a long time. One of the events that took place here was we actually had Helen Pankhurst come down and talk, and that was a very, very well attended event. We did our play there as well, and there again, that was another one of the little highlights of the year.
I think for me it would be about personally thinking, now that we know this information, how can I devise some arts projects that might help to continue to tell these stories, particularly to young people within the cottage environment. So, developing some arts activities around it would be really great. Also, for me personally, I've done learning around doing the research, and I've learnt so much about women in World War One. I have to say, I started out knowing virtually nothing. So I have, over the last year, it's been a tremendous learning experience for me, and I'd like to kind of to build on that.
It was very interesting. This is the first time I've been to the Isle of Sheppey. And I found some interesting things, like Charles Dickens wrote his book Oliver Twist here. I found some really interesting information about the war through this project I've been volunteering on, and the local people are really open to just having other people come into the island and just to talk to.
It's nice for the younger people to know about some of the history, and they're surprised. People are surprised about what history this island has got. So I'm glad it's worked out. It's lovely.
Okay, well my name's Amanda, and this is Leslie. I'm Leslie. And we are here at Sheppey Little Theatre, which is a lovely little place, a little gem of Sheppey that's adorable. And we are here for the Women at War. And we've seen some lovely, Big Fish have been singing some songs. And I love the way they put it in a sense of such fun, and how women
in a way we can understand, and really interesting to find out what the women actually did, and how they coped, and how they enjoyed it.
Yes, really good.
Really good fun.
It's fun so far.